Well, the last time we talked, you were in Toronto. You had been there for 10 years. You mentioned a call to St. Vincent Street in Glasgow, the congregation that you had attended under the ministry of the Reverend Douglas MacMillan. So then the next 14 years was a transition really from the Free Church to the RP Church. And without getting into a great deal of detail of the background, how did that change come about?
When I came here, I discovered over the years that in times past there had been some communication with the folks in Toronto and the RP Church, and at one point we considering moving, but for various reasons, that just in God's providence, that didn't come about. But as you're probably aware, maybe others are as well, in my time here, things in Scotland were changing in the church, particularly in terms of the understanding of the form of worship, exclusive psalmody and so on. And there was movement afoot in Scotland to change that position. Over the years, myself and either Sandy Finlayson, who was an elder here at that time, or his brother Rod, who is still with us in this session clerk, we would be heading over to the assembly. And we noticed and could hear on the floor of the assembly that there was a definite movement to change the church's position, stance on its form of worship. Allied to that in Scotland was the fact the Church of Scotland were also going through difficulties and so on. There was talk of Church of Scotland ministers leaving and becoming free church ministers and so on. And again, there's a lot of history, and historians, no doubt church historians in years to come, will give various views and understandings of why that was taking place. But to cut a long story short, I'd come to the conclusion, even within, I think, my third year here, that the church should be an Indigenous church. In other words, it should be Canadian. Because I knew that when I was in Scotland, and St. Vincent Street would often provide an elder for the General Assembly for Toronto, because Toronto at that time weren't able to send anybody over. And I knew, even then, nobody really gave a thought to the North American congregations. It was just, you saw them in the back page of the monthly record, in terms of givings and so on. As to who they were and what they were about, you never really gave any thought. That, by my third year, I felt, because people would say to me that I met in Toronto, so you're a Toronto church, and I would say, well, actually, we're Free Church of Scotland. And you could see the double take, you're in Canada, but you're Free Church of Scotland. I realised that itself was an impediment in many ways to witness. Things moved on apace in Scotland until eventually the split, as it was called, came about. Rod and I were over there at the assembly, the plenary assemblies they had. And so we realised that in our understanding here in Toronto, we were of a totally different mindset to those who were, who pushed for hymns and musical instruments. And that, along with the Indigenous position, we felt, again, in God's providence, that if there was a time to move and to become Indigenous, now was the time. So again, really from that point, it was about a 4 or 5 year process, because we still had people at that point whose parents had set up the church in Toronto. Naturally, because of their upbringing and so on, we're Free Church to the core. I have to confess that I found it hard. My head said one thing when my heart said another. I knew, we have to move, but the thought of leaving the church of my birth, my ancestors and so on, that I found hard at times to consider. Anyway, we were about 4 years. In fact, I think, Andrew, the first time we met would have been at a synod in the States, and this Rod and myself were there to meet with one of the committees, the RP committees, in terms of us being, coming into the RP church. And I think that was the first time you and I met.
That's right.
Well, again, cutting a long story short, things went well, and the amazing way God works. When I came to Toronto 24 years ago, I was told that Shepherd Avenue, where the church was, that's one of the main corridors that runs east to west, Toronto. where we're situated had been earmarked for many years for redevelopment, and there was always the thought that one day we're going to have to move, probably. Well, it so happened that as the talks with the RPs had begun, the developers started to have talks with us as well about our building and moving and so on. So in God's providence, these two things just dovetailed. Moving denominationally, but also moving physically, and the building of a new church building. And I thought again, with my Dunblane background, I'd been there when a new building was erected. Now here in Toronto, I'm in the same situation where a new building has been erected. So these two things came together, and when the night congregational meeting came, where we had to decide and take a vote as to what we were going to do, the wonderful thing was, and I'd said to Rod and Jim, the elders, I says, look, I says, we don't want to drive the people. I says, we have to lead, because I says, there are some of them. I says, this move, and I says, and I know it's a big thing. So the wonderful thing was, the night that we had the meeting and we had the vote, and Rod and Jim and myself went, to count the votes, it was totally unanimous. Everybody was behind it. And that was a real answer to prayer, because there were some that we thought might not be with us on it. It could have been problematic. But as it turned out, everything worked out well, and we ended up at Lord's Presbyterian meeting with us, welcoming us in to the RPs. And 4 years now, I think it is, have been extremely happy years. I think one of the things, and I've said to the guys, the welcome that we received at the beginning from the Presbytery and since then has been most encouraging. And you weren't made to feel, you're an incomer, or it was a case of, no, you're part of us now. I think for the future of the congregation, God willing, in very practical terms, when my time comes to either leave or the Lord takes me away or whatever, it will certainly be far easier for the folks here in Toronto in terms of finding another pastor. All of us within the congregation and the session, the welcome we received and the encouragement and so on since then, it's been wonderful.
That's great to hear. It's really encouraging, because it's not easy to bring a congregation from one denomination with a long history into another denomination. As you say, there are relationships there that have been established. It is again an indication of the God's grace upon the congregation there in Toronto.
I think one of the things that really struck me, I meant to say this, I realised with the young folk here a number of years ago, Scotland meant nothing to them, and rightly so. They're Canadian, and so it was just out there to them. But now they feel very much part of, they're part of a North American denomination, and I've seen them grow up, and now they're married, they've got their own children, and in terms, God willing, down the road, if things come back to normal, and their children grow up, things like conferences and so on, that they can meet other young people and hopefully, God willing, partners for life and things like that. So there are a lot of benefits, I think.
Absolutely. Well, that's been another really encouraging interview. It is always good to talk to you and to hear of what God does in your own life and what God does in the congregation.